Most of the people that I know in my real life, who I know around me and who I deal with, and my friends, they are queer. So my biggest indication of what straight relationships look like very often comes from media. And given that I watch a lot of horror, every once in a while I look at all of these relationships and I'm like, is this what straight people do? Is this how straight people are? Welcome to Vanessa Júpiter's sitting room. This is top 5 favorite bad husbands in horror. Warning, mentions of domestic abuse and self-harm. I'm doing it in order of the one that I hate the least towards the one that I hate the most. Obviously, I love all of them for their plots. That's the whole point of the story, is that they are bad husbands. But for the story to work, I need to kind of hate them. And thankfully I do. I hate all of these men. And we are going to be talking about them. Number 5 is from Honeymoon. Paul. Honeymoon is this movie from 2014 that starts very much as a romantic movie. They're on their honeymoon, obviously. Next thing you know, creepy stuff starts happening and it's not really clear what's going on. The thing that I like about Paul, and when things start getting really, really rough, it really feels like Paul could just become violent like this. The simple fact that Paul feels like potentially even a good boyfriend, even though he feels like he is potentially as good as he could be, he's still on the brink of violence at points. And it ties in very well with my second on the list. Number 4 is Walter from the Stepford Wives. If you have no idea of what the Stepford Wives is, um, Walter and Joe, they decide to move into the small idyllic town of Stepford, which is a suburban town from the US, and it was mostly Walter's idea. And once they get there, Walter really likes it, but Joe soon starts realizing how much there's something wrong with the women of Stepford, that they are all the perfect housewives. Slowly, Walter starts wanting Joe to become this perfect housewife. Very early in the movie, it's established how much of a feminist she is. Like, she's not even wearing a bra in the beginning of the movie. She's very clearly a feminist from the 70s, moving into the small town, being more and more oppressed and more put into the box of the housewife by the husband. In the beginning of the movie, Walter also doesn't come across as awful. Walter becomes progressively more and more disgusting as the movie goes along. He shares a very strong similarity with Paul from Honeymoon for me, of having this moment that I vividly remember from the experience of watching the movies, where I'm sitting there waiting for him to become violent towards Joe. It's just so sad that I have come to expect these men who, for all intents and purposes, are regular men within society. They're just straight men. And I have come to expect them to potentially become violent towards their wife. Moving on to one of my absolute favorite horror movies of all time, Possession. Possession is unique on this list in the context of it's the only movie of the 5 where the perspective is inarguably from the bad husband. Could be argued that that is also the case for Honeymoon to some extent, but Honeymoon is very much of both of them. Everything that happens within Possession happens from Mark's perspective. And honestly, Mark is so awful. Mark is also on the brink of violence. Mark is extremely possessive. Mark is extremely jealous. Mark is an overall just the worst husband that anyone could ask for. But Hannah isn't great either. Both of them just have the worst relationship. And early in the movie, there's that scene in the cafe where both of them are fighting and like pushing tables around in a very public setting and screaming at each other. It never feels like Mark is particularly in the wrong in that scene. It's just a bad relationship that they keep on insisting on having just because of the child that they have together and just because of heteronormative ideas of them being husband and wife. I mean, possession has so much to it, but it definitely sheds a light as well into this heteronormative idea of relationships, which I wouldn't even argue to be like one of the strongest themes in the movie, but in the context of discussing Mark as a bad husband, I think it's important to acknowledge that he is a really good example of bad heteronormativity within horror films. Next in my countdown, number two is Richie from Swallow. If you have no idea of what Swallow is the story of Hunter, this woman who lives in this like gorgeous, expensive house with her husband Richie. She starts feeling very oppressed by the system in general and by the fact that she's supposed to be a housewife. She never fully settles into that lifestyle very well, and Richie really insists on her fitting in when she really clearly cannot. So basically, she starts the psychological disorder of wanting to swallow objects. It's very much a self-harm type of practice. That's how I read it, at least. Richie just is increasingly unsupportive. His family was very rich and hers wasn't, so he very much feels like she owes him a debt. Richie is interesting in the sense of just being so bad and still managing to be realistic enough. If you behaved in a similar way to an ex-partner, you would see yourself and you wouldn't be happy by what you see. I think that Richie very much walks that line very perfectly of being inarguably evil and still real, which is one of the main reasons why he ranks number two in my list of five worst husbands in horror. But number one is Vincent from In My Skin. It was by far the most triggering movie watching experience I've ever had. If you have no idea what In My Skin is, it's the story of Esther. Esther is at a very high profile party. She goes out into the woods to have a walk. She falls into a hole. She hurts her leg extremely badly and she doesn't notice it. And after this point, she just starts self harming. If you're setting yourself up to watch In My Skin, be ready because you're going to be just watching someone self-harming for 1 hour and a half and it's going to be awful. I think that it's a really well-made movie. I think that it packs the punch that it's supposed to pack. And part of the reason why In My Skin packs the punch the way that it does is because of Vincent, the bad husband in the movie. There's the fact that Estelle opens up to Vincent early in the narrative about like how she had this issue with her leg, and Vincent is curious at first, and curiosity is fine when your partner starts dealing with mental health crises, but there's a very fine line between curiosity and shaming. So many times it feels like Vincent might not have crossed that line just yet. And to some extent, asking someone to be able to deal with a partner who's having a massive mental health crisis, how do you ask that? How do you deal with a partner that is having an extreme mental health crisis? And there's no set way. Blaming Vincent for having been the worst that he could be can seem a little unfair. How could he know what he was supposed to do? How could he know that him poking around would end up making Steph stop sharing what she was doing with him and stop asking for his help? Because this is what happens in the course of the movie. Estelle feels completely unsupported by Vincent. And there are specific moments where he does things that are bad and he notices it. And that's where it becomes even worse because he then apologizes. And the movie makes it even more difficult to think that he was the worst. Vincent eventually becomes very self centered. Vincent eventually starts caring more about his work and about his own problems outside of Estelle. And Vincent feels like a character that happens to be in a bad position, whereas Mark from Possession, whereas Richie from Swallow, those characters feel like they are here to create drama in the life of this female character. And that's not how Vincent feels at all. Vincent feels like the person who happened to be Estelle's husband, and he's not doing anything to amplify the drama. He's just being kind of insensitive, and he's being kind of self-centered, and he's asking kind of the wrong questions, and he's asking kind of too many questions. And can we really blame him? And I do, and I hate him, and I hate him. I hate him so much. I Watching the movie, I just kept being constantly frustrated with the fact that this woman going through this mental health crisis didn't have an emotional support system. The fact that her husband, who was supposed to be her emotional support system, was really not there for her in a way that would help her. And how realistic that felt, and how terrifying that felt. So, yes, Vincent, through realism, through multidimensional characterization, and through just insensitivity to an extreme degree, takes the cake and wins number one spot of my most hated bad husbands in horror. So this was my small deep dive within heteronormativity within horror films and talking about the bad husbands and how they are bad. Is this what heterosexuality looks like? Please tell me in the comments. Love, Vanessa Júpiter.